The front door of Bellamy's opened at 3:34 in the afternoon, and the woman who came through it was 34 minutes late for the only interview she had left that month. "I'm sorry I'm late." Cora Whitlock was 27, and she said it the way somebody says a thing they've had far too much practice saying. She wasn't alone. Her right hand was closed around the arm of a younger woman in dark glasses, and in that younger woman's free hand was a white cane, folded down to the length of a forearm. She explained it in 13 words. The bus had broken down. Her sister's afternoon aid had canceled at noon. After that, she didn't say anything else, and she didn't ask anyone to feel sorry for her, and that was the part somebody noticed. Margot Kessler, who ran the dining room, had already closed the folder on the table. Cora watched her close it. "I know I've ruined the first impression," she said. "Give me 15 minutes and I'll prove I work better than I arrive." From behind her, without turning her head, the girl in the dark glasses said, "She cooks better than she talks, too." Margot laughed before she could stop herself, and told them both to sit down. What neither sister could have known was that 2 floors above them, behind a pane of one-way glass, a man had been standing perfectly still for 4 minutes. He hadn't come to Bellamy's that afternoon to watch anybody. He'd come to sign 3 pages and leave. He was 34 years old, and in this city there were people who lowered their voices when his name came up in conversation. He wasn't a man who waited for anything. But he'd read the name on the top sheet of that stack of applications, and he hadn't moved since. If you believe the people who apologize the most are usually the ones who owe the least, please give this story a like. Share it with someone who's been carrying something heavy without ever complaining about it. And subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one deserve to be heard all the way to the end. Now let's go back to Bellamy's, to table 12, and to the man upstairs who still hasn't taken his eyes off the door. At that hour, there were only 2 kitchen assistants left in Bellamy's kitchen, wiping down cutting boards, and Margot led Cora straight past them without introducing her, as though she'd already made some kind of decision, but wasn't ready for anyone else to know. She opened a drawer, took out an onion, set it on the steel counter in front of Cora, and told her she had 15 minutes, and that Margot didn't care what she did with it. Cora took off her coat, folded it, and placed it on a chair. She didn't ask what ingredients were available. She didn't ask which burners were still working. She walked once around the kitchen, opened 3 cabinets, found what she needed, and came back. In the dining room, Neve was still sitting at table 12, her cane resting against the leg of the chair, one finger tapping steadily along the edge of the table to a rhythm only she understood. Cora began by breaking the onion in half instead of cutting it, and Margot raised an eyebrow. "My father did it this way," Cora said without looking up. "He said a knife makes an onion cry too soon." When the pan began to hiss, the tapping at table 12 stopped. Then Neve's voice carried in from the dining room, not loud, but clear enough. "You've got the heat higher than usual." Cora turned the knob down 1 notch without saying anything. Margot looked toward the kitchen doorway, then back at the woman standing over the pan, and she said nothing. While they waited, she pulled out a chair, sat down, and asked why Cora had left her previous job. Cora answered smoothly, almost without needing to think, saying that the schedule there no longer worked for her and that she wanted to find somewhere more stable. It was a polished, tidy answer, worn smooth from having been used many times. From the dining room, Neve's voice came again, softer this time. "Your voice just went up half a note." Cora went still for a beat. Margot didn't ask another question, but she didn't look away either. The truth was that Cora hadn't left on her own. She'd been let go because in the space of 1 month she'd asked to leave early in the middle of a shift 3 times, and all 3 times had been for the same reason, one she had never explained to anyone there. She didn't say that. She only stirred the onions, lowered the heat, and said, "I need somewhere I can stay for a long time." Margot nodded, and didn't press further. The smell of the onions began to change. It was no longer sharp, but sweet and deep. The kind of smell you only get when you're willing to stand there long enough without growing impatient. The 2 kitchen assistants had stopped wiping the cutting boards. Just as Cora poured stock into the pan, footsteps sounded on the staircase behind the kitchen. A man came down holding 3 signed sheets of paper, and instead of walking past, he stopped on the last step. Cora didn't know who he was. No one introduced him. Margot stood up, and the way she stood drew Cora's attention more than the man himself. He didn't look at the pan. He looked at Cora, then asked exactly 1 question, his voice as calm as if he were asking the time. "How long did you leave it there before adding the liquid?" Cora answered immediately, without rounding it off, without giving a number. until the bottom of the pan changed color for the second time. The first is the sugar in the onion. The second is what you're actually waiting for. The man said nothing else. He watched her for another moment, then turned to Margot and gave one nod. Just one, brief, without a word. Then he went back up the stairs and disappeared. Margot watched until the sound of his footsteps was completely gone. Cora waited for her to say something, but she didn't. She simply reached for a spoon, tasted the pan, set the spoon down, and told Cora to turn off the heat. "Is he the owner?" Cora asked. Margot picked up the file from the table, the one she'd folded closed earlier. "Just call him management." Cora didn't ask again. She washed her hands, took off the apron, and walked out into the dining room, where Neve was still sitting exactly where she'd been. The girl tilted her head toward the staircase, even though no one was there anymore. "That man who just came down," Neve said. "His voice doesn't sound like someone who works in a restaurant." Cora sat down across from her. "What does it sound like?" Neve thought for longer than usual. "Like someone who's used to giving orders, but doesn't like giving them." Cora laughed and told her to stop guessing at things. Then the two sisters got up and left, and as they walked toward the exit, Cora didn't think about the man on the staircase even once. She was too busy calculating how many days were left before the rent was due, but the two sisters never made it outside. Margot called after them from the kitchen doorway and told Cora to come back because she needed her to sign a temporary form before leaving, and it would only take a few minutes. Cora told Neve to stay right where she was at table 12 and not go anywhere, then went back inside. Those few minutes lasted longer than she expected. Margot had to find the form in the bottom drawer, then call someone to ask about an employee identification number. When Cora walked back into the dining room, Neve's chair was empty. Her cane was still leaning against the leg of the chair. That was the first thing Cora saw, and it was the thing that made her chest turn cold. The dining room no longer looked the way it had a few minutes earlier. The evening shift was about to begin. Employees were pushing tables together into long rows for a large reservation. The aisles between them had been moved, and the space Neve had spent the entire afternoon memorizing had become a completely different place. Cora didn't scream. She didn't run either. She walked, calling her sister's name in the calmest voice she could manage. So calm that anyone listening might have thought she was simply calling her in for dinner, because Cora knew something no one else in that restaurant knew. The thing Neve feared most in the world wasn't darkness. It wasn't being lost. It was hearing people panic because of her. It was knowing that an entire room had been forced to stop because of her. So Cora kept her voice steady, moving from one row of tables to the next, bending down to look underneath them, asking every server whether they'd seen a girl wearing dark glasses. No one had. One person said they thought they'd seen someone heading toward the back of the room while they were moving a table. Another said they weren't sure. Cora's hands began to tremble, and she clenched them into fists so no one would see. The background music was still playing, an instrumental piece coming through the ceiling speakers, the kind of sound no one in the room was paying attention to, not even Cora. Then footsteps sounded on the staircase. The man from earlier came down, and this time he didn't stop on the last step. He looked at the cane leaning beside table 12, then at Cora, and he understood what was happening before anyone had a chance to explain. He didn't ask a question. He turned to the shift manager and said, "Turn off the music." The man hesitated for half a second, because guests had already begun arriving. He didn't repeat himself. He only looked at him, and the music stopped. Then he said one sentence to the entire room, his voice no louder than usual, yet everyone heard it. No one speaks. No one moves. And the strangest thing was that everyone obeyed. A server carrying a tray stopped in the middle of the aisle. Two people moving a table lowered it carefully and froze where they stood. The entire restaurant fell into a silence so thick that Cora could hear the ice machine behind the bar. The man stepped closer to her without touching her and spoke softly. "Don't call her name again." Cora spun toward him, her eyes red. "You've called 3 times. If your sister could hear you, she would have answered. That means wherever she is, your voice can't reach her." He paused for a beat. "Make a sound she'll recognize. Not her name. A sound." Cora stood there, and for one moment, her mind went completely blank. That terrible moment when a person forgets everything they know about the person they love most. Then she remembered. She remembered the old apartment, the first night the power went out after Neve came home from the hospital, when the 14-year-old girl sat in her room too frightened to call out. And Cora hadn't known what else to do except knock on the wall to let her know she was still there. 3 knocks. Always 3 knocks. Cora walked to the wooden column near the bar, raised her hand, and knocked. 3 times. Slow, evenly spaced. In that silent room, the sound seemed impossibly loud. Nothing answered. Cora knocked again. A young server swallowed hard. Margot lifted a hand to her mouth. Cora knocked a 3rd time, and this time her hand struck harder than it needed to, and she heard her own breath break as she inhaled. Then it came. From the far end of the hallway leading toward the cold storage area, faint and thin and distorted by the thick door between them, came 3 answering knocks, slow, evenly spaced. The entire restaurant turned in the same direction. Cora ran. The hallway leading to the cold storage room was narrower and darker than the dining room, and at the very end of it, down on the floor against the steel wall, Neve was sitting with her knees drawn tightly to her chest. She wasn't crying. Both arms were wrapped around her shins, her chin resting on her knees, her lips already turning blue, and when she heard her sister's footsteps, she only lifted her head and said in a voice so calm, it was frightening that she was fine. Cora dropped to her knees on the floor and pulled her into her arms. She didn't ask why Neve had wandered off. She didn't ask why she hadn't stayed where she'd been told. She simply wrapped both arms around her shoulders and held her there, and for a long while neither sister said anything. Then Neve spoke, still softly, saying she'd only wanted to find the restroom. She had counted the steps from table 12 to the hallway door earlier that afternoon, and she remembered the number exactly. But when she stood up, everything had been moved, and the steps she counted had led her somewhere else. She hadn't wanted to call out to anyone. She thought that if she did, Cora would have to come running out in the middle of her trial shift, and then what happened last month would happen all over again. Cora closed her eyes. "I didn't want you to lose another job because of me," Neve said. Cora couldn't answer. She only took off her coat and wrapped it around her sister's shoulders, then slipped one hand beneath Neve's elbow to help her stand, and Neve's hand was so cold that Cora had to clench her teeth to keep from making a sound. The man stood at the head of the hallway a few steps away, and he didn't come any closer. He didn't reach out a hand. He didn't say anything like, "Let me help." He simply stood there and kept his distance, and when the sisters passed him, Neve stopped. The girl turned her head in exactly the direction where the man was standing, as precisely as though she could see him. "You spoke to my sister earlier," Neve said. "You didn't lower your voice when you spoke in the room earlier. No one ever does that. Thank you." The man opened his mouth, then stopped. He couldn't find anything to say. The 2 sisters disappeared through the front entrance, and he remained standing in the dark hallway for a long time after they were gone, one hand resting against the wall, and if anyone had seen him then, they might have been surprised, because very few people in this city had ever seen Elias Ferraro stand that way. That night, in the room on the 3rd floor of Bellamy's, he summoned Otto Brenner. Otto had worked for the family since Elias's father's time, and he was one of the very few men who still dared sit down before being invited. Elias pushed the applicant file across the desk. "I need you to look into this woman." Otto glanced down at the paper, but he didn't pick it up right away. "You don't investigate someone you're planning to hire into a kitchen. Since when are you so concerned with rules?" Otto didn't answer. He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, wrote down the name, then closed it. He only closed it 1 beat more slowly than usual, and Elias, who was looking out the window at the time, didn't notice. "I'm not checking her out because I want to hire her," Elias said. "You know about that list." Otto did. Throughout the past season, Elias had ordered a full audit of all the old loans carrying the family name, the ones his father had left behind and his cousin still continued to manage, and Elias wanted every one of them closed for good. In that audit was one line that had made him stop writing. A loan marked as closed, with the reason given in a few short words: borrower deceased. The borrower's name was Reuben Whitlock. The amount collected had exceeded the original loan by a considerable margin, and Elias had spent the entire season having people search for the man's family so he could return the excess. They couldn't find them. No one lived at the old address anymore. None of the phone numbers still worked. Then that afternoon, Margot had handed him the stack of applications for the morning shift, and the name on the first page was Whitlock. "What are you planning to do?" Otto asked. "Give them their money back." And after that, Elias didn't answer that question. He only told Otto to do the search, and Otto stood and walked out, and at the doorway he stopped for a second and turned his head as though he were about to say something, then decided against it. Every Sunday, the private room on the 3rd floor of Bellamy's was closed to customers, and open to people who carried the Ferraro name or had worked for the family long enough to be considered one of their own. More than 10 people sat around the long table. The food had been served for some time, and no one touched their plate until Elias picked up his fork. It wasn't a rule anyone had ever written down. It was simply the way things had been since the day his father died, and no one had ever bothered to ask why. Frank Odell sat on the other side of the table, several seats away from Elias, and he was the only person in the room who had a habit of talking while everyone else was eating. He brought up the fact that Elias was renovating the kitchen, that Elias had gone to the wholesale market himself on Tuesday morning, that Elias was hiring more people for the morning shift. Then he laughed and said that Elias's father had left him a name the entire city was forced to respect, while Elias was sitting around calculating how many cents an onion was worth. A few people laughed with him. Not many. Elias didn't look up right away. He finished the bite he was eating, then set his knife down against the edge of the plate. That was all. He didn't slam it down, didn't throw anything, didn't say a word. The faint sound of metal touching porcelain carried across the table, and everyone fell silent. The man beside Frank stopped chewing. Someone set down a glass without remembering to drink from it. Elias looked directly at his cousin and held his gaze. Not for long, only long enough, then picked up his knife and continued eating. Frank smiled, but the smile disappeared half a beat sooner than it should have, and at the far end of the table Otto Brenner noticed and said nothing. Monday morning, Margot called Cora. Morning shift, 6 days a week, health insurance after the probationary period. Cora listened to everything, thanked her in a perfectly ordinary voice, then ended the call, walked into the restroom at the bus station where she'd been waiting, locked the door, and cried for 3 minutes. Not because she was happy, because for the first time in a very long while, she wouldn't have to calculate which expense she was going to cut that month. When those 3 minutes were over, she washed her face, smoothed her hair, and went to work the evening job she still hadn't quit. That evening, when she walked into the parking lot behind her apartment building, a man was leaning against the car parked beside hers. He was neatly dressed, middle-aged, and he greeted her by name. "Miss Whitlock." Cora stopped. "My name is Curtis Mallory. I work for the people your father borrowed money from." He didn't come any closer. In fact, he took half a step back to leave her a clear path to her car door, a gesture so polite it sent a chill down the spine. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, and held it toward her. "I know you've been making regular payments. I know you work 2 jobs. I'm not here to make things difficult for you." Cora didn't take the paper. He placed it neatly on the hood of her car, smoothed it flat, then stepped back. "But interest doesn't care how many jobs you work. The number now isn't the same number it was when your father was alive. I only want you to see it, so later you can't say no one told you." He paused, then added in the friendliest voice he'd used so far. "I hear your sister takes the bus route along the avenue. That route gets crowded around rush hour. You should tell the girl to stand farther back while she's waiting for the bus." Cora heard every word clearly. Her expression didn't change. She thanked him for letting her know, her voice completely flat, then asked whether there was anything else. Mallory said no, wished her a pleasant evening, and walked away. Cora remained standing there until the sound of his car had disappeared completely. Then she opened her door, sat behind the wheel, and closed it again. She didn't start the engine. She placed both hands on the steering wheel and gripped it tightly, and she stayed that way for a long time in the dark parking lot, until her hands stopped shaking, because she knew that once she went upstairs, Neve would hear immediately if there was anything different in her voice. Cora had been working at Bellamy's for a few weeks when open kitchen night came around, something the restaurant did once a month without advertising it to anyone. That evening, the dining room was closed to regular customers. Only employees and their families were there, and anyone who wanted to bring someone along was welcome to do so. Margot told Cora to bring her sister, and Cora had been about to refuse. Then she looked at Neve and changed her mind. When the 2 sisters walked in, the person standing at the main stove wasn't the head chef. It was the man from the staircase. His sleeves were rolled past his elbows. His apron was tied slightly crooked, and he was arguing with one of the kitchen assistants about when the garlic should go in, and he was losing. Cora stopped dead in the doorway. That was when she finally learned his name, because someone called him Elias, and Margot, standing beside her, only said quietly that he'd trained as a cook on the other side of the ocean for a few years before his father died, and he had to return to Chicago. She said nothing more about what came after. Elias looked up and saw Cora, then pointed toward a pot at the far end of the kitchen and told her to keep an eye on it. No greeting, no introduction. Neve was taken to sit at the bar beside the kitchen entrance, and she sat there with both hands resting on the counter, her head tilted slightly, simply listening. After a while, she called into the kitchen that the pan on the right was getting dry. No one paid attention. 3 seconds later, smoke rose from the pan, and the kitchen assistant jumped. Everyone in the kitchen turned toward the bar. Neve shrugged. The sound changes before it burns. It always does. Elias wiped his hands on his apron and walked out to the bar. Can you hear any of the other pots? Neve tilted her head, the big one boiling in the middle. It's about to boil over. Not yet. 3 seconds. Elias turned and looked at the pot. 3 seconds later, it boiled over. The entire kitchen burst out laughing, and the kitchen assistant threw both hands into the air as though he'd just lost a bet, and someone said they wouldn't need a timer anymore. Elias told them to bring out a tall stool and set it beside the kitchen entrance for Neve. For the rest of the evening, she sat there calling things out one by one: which pot was about to run dry, which pan had the heat turned too high, who had just opened the refrigerator and forgotten to close it. And every time she was right, the kitchen laughed. And every time she was wrong, the kitchen laughed too. And not once was that laughter directed at her. Cora stood at the side station, her hands still stirring, her eyes drifting toward her sister. She couldn't remember the last time Neve had sat in the middle of a crowd instead of at its edge. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had needed Neve to do something instead of asking whether she needed help. By the end of the evening, when everyone else had gone out to sit in the dining room and only Cora and Elias remained in the kitchen finishing the washing up, she spoke without thinking. You know, you've never had to tell me to do something twice. He was stacking pans on the rack. He stopped. Only for a beat, so brief that if she'd been looking down into the sink, she would have missed it. Everywhere else, people have to remind me 3 or 4 times about the same thing, she continued. You don't. You say it once and leave it there. I like that. Elias placed the last pan on the rack and didn't turn around immediately. When he finally did, his face was normal again. If you do it right the first time, why would I tell you again? That's not what I mean, Cora said. You don't repeat yourself with anyone. I've noticed. He looked at her for a moment. From the dining room came the sound of Neve telling someone about the burned pan, followed by laughter. You should go be with your sister, he said. Cora dried her hands and walked out, never knowing that behind her, the man remained standing alone in the kitchen for a long while, because she had just praised him for a habit he hadn't learned in any kitchen, and he knew exactly where he'd learned it. Cora's birthday fell on a Wednesday, and she'd forgotten about it until she got home and found Neve waiting at the kitchen table with a box in front of her. The box was small, the paper old, tied with a piece of bakery string. Cora asked where she'd gotten it, and Neve told her to open it first and ask questions afterward. Inside was an old wristwatch, the glass face marked by a scratch running diagonally across it. The leather strap softened from years of being worn by someone before it was sold. Nev said she'd bought it at the consignment shop on the corner, using money she'd earned translating books into Braille over the past few months, and had kept hidden from her sister. Cora turned the watch over. On the back was a line engraved with the kind of inexpensive machine small shops often used, the lettering slanting slightly downward at the end as though the engraver's hand had slipped, or as though whoever had dictated the words had spoken too quickly. You've never been late for me. Cora couldn't say anything. She stood there holding the watch, and Neve waited a moment before asking whether the engraving had come out wrong, because the man at the shop had told her it was beautiful. Cora said no. It was beautiful, her voice perfectly normal, and Neve nodded with satisfaction. The girl couldn't see her sister's face. That evening, Cora went to her shift at Bellamy's and worked exactly as she did every other night, and after everyone had gone home, she climbed to the restaurant roof by way of the fire escape stairs, the place where the kitchen assistants usually went to smoke. Elias was already there. He didn't ask why she'd come up. She sat down some distance away from him, and for a long while neither of them spoke, and then she raised her wrist to check the time even though she didn't need to know what time it was, and he noticed the watch. New? My sister gave it to me. Today's my birthday. He didn't wish her a happy birthday. Cora was grateful for that. Then she heard herself begin to tell him something she'd never told anyone. Not even the man she'd once planned to marry several years earlier, and she didn't understand why it was happening now, or why it was happening with this man. She said that when Neve was 14, their mother had been dead only a few months. Their father worked constantly, and some weeks they only saw him on Sunday mornings, and no one in the house understood why he had to work so much. Cora had been 22 then. There was no one to call. No relatives lived nearby. Then one night Neve developed a high fever. Cora sat beside her all night, changing cool cloths, checking her temperature, writing down every reading on a scrap of paper, because she was afraid she might remember one of them wrong. There was $60 in the kitchen drawer. That was all the money the household had until the next paycheck. Twice that night, Cora stood up. Twice she picked up the phone intending to call an ambulance, and both times she put it back down because Neve seemed to be settling, because she thought that if they could just make it until morning, the clinic would open and everything would cost many times less. She believed she still had time. By morning, she didn't. A doctor told her in the hospital hallway that if they'd come in earlier, things might have been different. He said it very gently, and Cora had carried that sentence with her ever since. She lost her sight in less than a week, she said. And I was sitting right beside her that whole night. I was there. I just couldn't bring myself to spend $60. The wind moved across the rooftop, and Cora didn't wipe her face. Elias said nothing for a very long time. He didn't tell her not to blame herself. He didn't say anyone in her position would have done the same thing. He didn't reach for her. Then he spoke. You were 22. Your mother had just died. There was no one else in the house. That's not an excuse. Cora turned and looked at him. That's what happened, he said. You've told that story inside your own head how many times now? But you've never heard someone else tell it back to you. You don't need someone to tell you that you were innocent. You need someone to sit here and say the truth out loud for you, so you can hear that when it's spoken, it still sounds exactly the way it happened. Cora didn't answer. She lowered her eyes to the watch on her wrist, and she realized it was running slow. Not by much. Only a few minutes. She didn't adjust it. The following Sunday morning, Elias told Cora that he needed to take a box of things out to Oak Park and asked whether she wanted to come along. His voice as casual as if he were asking whether she wanted more coffee. She agreed before she had time to wonder why he was asking. The house in Oak Park was old and low, with a wooden fence bleached gray by the years, and the person who opened the door was an elderly woman with silver hair, wearing a gray cardigan, standing perfectly straight, looking at Cora with one eye. The other had been gone for a very long time. Elias introduced Cora as one of the morning cooks at Bellamy's, and the old woman said her name was Rosalind, then held out her hand, not to shake Cora's, but to take it. She turned Cora's palm upward and pressed her thumb against the knuckle of the index finger, where a thin callus had formed. A cook's hands, she said. This one comes from holding a knife. This one comes from grabbing a hot pan, before you have time to reach for a towel. I used to have hands like these too. Elias carried the box around to the back of the house, and while he was gone, the two women sat down in the living room. Rosalind asked how long Cora had been working there, asked whether Margot still forgot to turn off the storeroom light, asked whether anyone had finally replaced the gas valve on the main stove that had been making noise for years. Cora was surprised that she knew the restaurant so well, and Rosalind only said that the place had never been in her son's name, that it had remained in hers since the day her husband died, and that she preferred to keep it that way. She said it as lightly as if she were talking about the weather, then moved on to something else. Cora asked whether she went down to the restaurant often. Rosalind shook her head. I stopped going there a long time ago. Then she added, without any emotion in her voice, that she had lost this eye on the night she asked her husband a question. Women in this family weren't allowed to ask. She said nothing more. She poured the tea and changed the subject, and Cora understood that even if she asked, there wouldn't be another answer. When Elias came back inside, they talked for a while about ordinary, harmless things, and before they left, Rosalind told her son to go out to the car first, because she wanted to say a few words to this young woman about a cake recipe she'd promised to give her. Elias went outside. The door closed. Rosalind sat down in the chair across from Cora, and she didn't say a word about cake. Have you noticed how fast he eats? She asked. Cora stared at her, caught off guard. He's eaten fast since he was a boy, because in this family, whoever finished last was the one who had to sit there and hear everything people said at the table. She rested her hands on her knees. I married when I was younger than you are now. For years and years, I didn't ask. I didn't ask where the money came from. I didn't ask why some people came to my house for dinner and were never seen again afterward. I thought silence was the way I loved my husband. I thought that if I didn't ask, then everything could still remain a family. She looked at Cora, with her one good eye. Do you know what years of silence give birth to? They gave me my son. A decent man. Truly decent. And I'm not saying that because I'm his mother, but he's trapped inside a name he never chose. And he grew up in a house where his mother never asked a single question. Cora didn't know what to say. I saw him ask you to come with him today, Rosalind said. He's never brought anyone here before, so I'm going to tell you one thing, and then you can do whatever you want with it. She leaned forward. If you care about him, don't do what I did. Don't stay silent. Don't mistake the fact that he says little for the fact that he's all right. Don't leave him alone. Outside, a car door closed. Rosalind straightened in her chair and said in an ordinary voice that she would write out the cake recipe and send it later, then walked Cora all the way to the gate and waved goodbye to her son. All the way back to Chicago, Elias asked whether his mother had said anything. Cora looked out the car window. She gave me a cake recipe, she said. Otto brought back the results of the investigation one evening in the middle of the week, and there was one line that made Elias read it twice. The person collecting payments on the loan under the Whitlock name wasn't working for the family. It was Curtis Mallory, an independent debt collector, and he was collecting under the Ferraro name not on just one account, but on a long list of them. Elias had him summoned to Bellamy's after closing. Mallory arrived on time, dressed neatly, and sat down across from Elias with the manner of a man who believed he'd been invited rather than called in. On the table between them sat a candle still burning from the dinner shift and a stack of papers. Elias didn't greet him. He pushed the papers across the table. Read them. Read all of it, Mallory read. The farther he went, the flatter his expression became. It was the complete list of debts he was collecting, along with the original principal, the amount already collected, and the dates. Near the bottom was the name Reuben Whitlock. I have 2 things to tell you, Elias said. You choose one. He tapped a finger against the stack of papers. First option. You sign the last page. It says that you created this entire list and collected money under a name that wasn't yours. After you sign it, you'll go to every house on this list, every single one. You'll stand at their door and tell them what you did. Mallory gave a dry laugh. And the second option? The second option is that I do nothing. Mallory's smile slowly disappeared. I leave it alone. I don't touch you. But tomorrow morning, a few people will hear that you sat in this room tonight and gave me the name of the person behind you. The room stayed silent for a long time. Mallory stared at the candle. He wet his lips. You already know, he said quietly. You already know who it is. I want to hear you say it. Mallory shook his head. He didn't speak. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulled out a crumpled restaurant receipt, turned it over, picked up Elias's pen from the table, and wrote something on the back. It was short. It took him less than a second. Then he pushed the receipt across the table with 2 fingers as though it were hot. After that, he looked up and spoke loudly and clearly, loud enough for anyone in the hallway to hear. I don't know anything. I work alone. No one is behind me. Elias pulled the receipt toward himself. He read it. His expression didn't change. He folded the paper in half, then into quarters, then lifted it and held it to the candle flame. The corner caught fire and burned quickly. He dropped it onto the porcelain plate on the table, and the 2 men sat there watching until it was completely gone. When nothing remained but ash, Elias brushed his hands together. I don't know anything either. Mallory let out a long breath, and there was something in it, almost like gratitude. Then he understood the second thing, and his face went pale. But you're still giving me 2 choices. Yes. You just burned the only thing that could save me. I just burned the only thing that could kill you, Elias said. There's nothing that can save you. You've been doing this to yourself for years. Mallory sat still. Outside, someone could be heard dragging a chair across the dining room floor. If I sign, he said, people are going to ask who I worked for. They will. How you answer is your business. But if the day comes when you're sitting in front of someone wearing a uniform and they ask you officially, I hope you remember tonight. Mallory looked at the porcelain plate filled with ash. You're not like your father. No. Your father didn't give people choices. I know, Elias said. Then he pushed the pen across the table. Mallory picked it up. His hand was trembling, and he had to put it down once before picking it up again. He signed the last page, and when he was finished, Elias gathered the papers, put them into a drawer, and locked it. He didn't tell Mallory that the paper he'd just signed proved only one thing. It proved Mallory had created those debts. There wasn't a single word in it about the person who had told him to create them. 3 nights later, Otto came up to the 3rd floor room without calling ahead. He wasn't carrying his notebook the way he usually did. He was carrying a thick file with a hard cover, its corners worn down, and the edges of the paper faded to a pale yellow. The kind of color paper only takes on after sitting in a drawer for a very long time. He placed it on the table in front of Elias and didn't say a word. "What's this?" "Just read it." Otto stepped back, pulled out a chair, and sat in the corner of the room, far from the table, and he remained there for the rest of the night without saying another word. Elias opened the file. The first page was a contract for accounting services, signed between a construction company bearing the Ferraro name and a man named Reuben Whitlock. Elias stopped there for a long time. The man hadn't been a debtor. He'd been hired. The pages that followed contained material inventories, subcontractor invoices, and a series of reconciliations Reuben had prepared by hand, the numbers small and even, some of them underlined twice. Elias didn't need anyone to explain what he was looking at. He had read enough books and records in his life to understand. The same quantity of materials had been entered twice under the names of 2 different contractors. The difference in the money had been routed into an account whose owner Elias knew very well. Near the end of the file was a final settlement certification form, and the line where the accountant was supposed to sign had been left blank. Beside that blank space, Reuben Whitlock had written a short note by hand, addressed to no one in particular, stating simply that he couldn't certify those figures. The last page was a copy of a promissory note bearing his name, with a signature Elias knew at a glance wasn't written by the same hand that had filled the earlier pages. He sat there for a long time. Then he took out a blank sheet of paper and began writing down dates. The date Reuben refused to sign. The date the promissory note was created. The date the first payment was entered into the books. When he finished, he read it over, crossed everything out, and started again because he thought he had copied one of the numbers incorrectly. The second time gave him exactly the same result. He did it a 3rd time, slowly this time, following each line with the tip of his pen, and the result still didn't change. He set the pen down. There was another date in his mind now, one that wasn't anywhere in this file, a date he'd heard on the restaurant roof one windy night, when a woman sitting some distance away had told him that her sister had developed a high fever when she was 14. He knew how old Neve was now. He counted backward. Then he counted again. That false debt had begun before that night. Not a few days before. Long before it. For more than 2 years before that night, the family had been paying interest regularly on money no one had ever borrowed. Their father had worked so much that some weeks the family only saw him on Sunday mornings, and no one in the house had understood why. Elias closed his eyes. He remembered exactly what Cora had said, and the way she'd said it, calmly, like she was reading a line from an official report. There were $60 left in the kitchen drawer. That was all the money in the house until the next paycheck. He opened his eyes and looked toward Otto in the corner. Otto didn't look back. "Do you know what my family's name is worth, Otto?" Otto didn't answer. $60, Elias said. Exactly the amount they had left in their kitchen that night. He didn't say it loudly. There was nothing in his voice that sounded like anger. That was the worst part. He stood, walked to the window, and remained there with his back turned, and for a long while the only sound in the room was the traffic on the street below. "She sat beside that girl all night," he said. Twice she picked up the phone. She was 22 years old. Her mother had just died, and there was no one else in the house. He paused. "And all these years, she's believed it was her fault." Otto lowered his head and looked at his hands resting on his knees. "She doesn't know," Elias continued. "She'd never guess. How could she? Who would ever think that the money missing from their kitchen drawer had been taken away 2 years earlier by a name she would someday end up working for?" He turned around. "How long have you had this?" Otto looked up. He opened his mouth, then stopped. And in that moment, Elias saw something on the old man's face that he had never seen in all the years he'd known him. But his mind was occupied with something else, so he didn't ask again. The next morning, Cora came in for her shift earlier than usual, and Elias was already sitting at table 12 with the file in front of him. He didn't invite her to sit down. He only pushed it across the table and told her to read it. She asked what it was. "It belonged to your father," he said. Then he continued, and there was nothing in his voice for her to hold on to. "There's enough in there to destroy me. My family's name is all over those pages. If you walk out of here with it and hand it to anyone you want, I'm finished. I'm not giving it to you to ask you not to do that. I'm giving it to you because it's yours." Cora sat down. She read slowly, and she read for a very long time. She didn't understand everything in the file, but she understood enough. She knew her father's handwriting. She recognized immediately the way he wrote the number 7 with a line through it, the way he underlined something twice when he disagreed with it. She turned to the page with the blank space on the accountant's signature line, and she sat there for a long time staring at the sentence he'd written beside it in his own hand. Then she kept turning pages, and she found the list. A long list of names, addresses, amounts of money, with a final column showing the status of each account. No one in that column had lost their home to foreclosure. Not one person. She looked up. Why didn't anyone lose their house? Elias didn't answer immediately. Read the page with the signature again. She turned back to it, and then she understood. If you want to foreclose on someone's house, you have to take them to court, he said. If you want to take them to court, the paperwork has to be clean. If the paperwork is going to be clean, it needs an accountant's certification. Your father was the accountant. Cora rested her hand on the page. He didn't sign, Elias said. And because he didn't sign, all those years, no one on that list could be dragged into court. They still had to pay interest. They still suffered. But no one lost their home. Your father managed to do one thing, and he did it by refusing to put his name in one place. Cora didn't cry. She only sat there with her hand resting on the paper. No one on this list knows who he was, she said. No one. She began reading the list from top to bottom, slowly, as though speaking those names aloud was the only thing she could still do for her father. She got partway through, then stopped. She read one line again. Then she jerked her head up and looked toward the counter, where Margot Kessler was checking reservation slips for the lunch shift. Cora stood, picked up the file, walked straight over, set it on the counter, opened it to that exact page, and pointed to the name. Margot looked down. She didn't seem surprised. She put down her pen, removed her glasses, and spent a long time cleaning them before she spoke. I knew you'd find it sooner or later. You knew, Cora said. You knew from the beginning. I knew the name, only the name. She put her glasses back on. Back then, I'd lost my husband. I had 2 small children and a house in my name. They came to me. They gave me a loan. Then I realized the amount I borrowed wasn't the amount I was expected to repay. I paid for years. There were times I thought they were about to take the house. Then nothing happened. I never understood why. I thought maybe I'd just gotten lucky. She looked down at the file. Turns out it wasn't luck. Cora heard her own voice go dry. So you hired me because of my last name? Margot raised her eyes and looked directly at her. No. Tell me the truth. I am telling you the truth. She pushed the file back toward Cora. That day, I'd already closed your application. I was going to send you home. If someone is 34 minutes late, sending them home is normal for me. I've done it to other people. She paused. Then I looked at the cane in that girl's hand. Cora said nothing. You brought her with you, Margot said. You knew bringing her would probably ruin the interview. You brought her anyway. Because you didn't have another choice, and you weren't going to pretend that you did. She picked up her pen again, and her hand trembled slightly. When I was your age, I left my 2 children home alone and lied to my job that I didn't have any children. I kept the job. I kept it for years. She lowered her eyes to the reservation slip. I hired you because I didn't have that kind of courage when I was your age. Your last name, I only learned what it meant 1 minute ago. That Saturday night, Elias brought the file to the sister's apartment because Cora wanted to keep it, and he didn't come alone. Otto drove and came upstairs with him, standing in the hallway outside the apartment while Elias went inside. And then Otto made a short phone call out there. Only a few sentences, his voice low. Neve was in the kitchen. She was pouring herself a glass of water, and she stopped halfway through, still holding the glass in her hand, her head tilted toward the door. She remained that way until the voice in the hallway went silent. Then she set the glass down without drinking, and went straight to her room. For the next 3 days, Neve barely spoke. It wasn't sulking, because she still answered when someone asked her something, still said thank you, still told her sister not to worry. But she didn't come out to eat with Cora. She said she'd already eaten. She said she wasn't hungry. Monday morning, she skipped her Braille class. Tuesday afternoon, she sat on the edge of her bed for hours with both hands resting in her lap. And when Cora came in, Neve said she was only thinking. Cora touched her forehead, asked whether she had a fever, asked whether anything hurt, and Neve shook her head. Cora asked whether someone had said something to her that night. Neve said no one had said anything at all. By Tuesday evening, Cora sat at the kitchen table for a long time after her sister had gone to her room, thinking through the worst possibilities, and not one of them was right. Wednesday evening, Cora cooked dinner and asked Elias to come over, partly because she wanted someone else in the apartment, partly because she thought Neve might come out if they had company. Otto drove Elias over, and Cora invited him inside too. He hesitated, then came in, and Cora poured him a cup of tea. Nev did come out. She sat down in her usual chair, didn't eat, and kept both hands folded in her lap. For a while, no one said anything. Then Neve placed both hands flat on the table. "Cora," she said. Cora looked up. "Do you remember the night Dad died?" The whole table went silent. "I remember," Neve said. "I was home. Dad was in the kitchen. The phone rang and he answered it. I was standing behind the door, and I heard the entire conversation. I could hear the person on the other end clearly because Dad had the phone on speaker. He always used speaker because he was usually working with both hands." Cora stopped breathing. "After that, Dad grabbed his coat and left. He told me to go to bed, that he'd be right back. Those were the last words he ever said to me." Neve paused. "I remember the other person's voice. I've remembered it all this time. I don't remember faces, you know that. I remember voices, and I thought I'd go my whole life without ever hearing that voice again." She drew in a breath. 3 days ago, I heard it again, outside our apartment. Somewhere at the table, a spoon touched a plate. No one moved. The person who called Dad that night, Neve said, was standing in our home. Cora turned sharply toward Elias. She didn't think first. She simply turned, and for one brief moment, everything she'd believed over the past few months hung suspended between them. Elias's face had gone white. He couldn't say a word, but he wasn't looking at Cora. He turned his head to the right. He looked at Otto. Otto Brenner sat motionless at the end of the table. He lifted his cup of tea, then didn't drink from it. He set it back down very gently, and the sound of porcelain touching the saucer seemed louder than anything that had been said in that room all evening. "Yes," he said. "It was me. No one told Otto to keep talking. He did it on his own. He said that night he'd been sent to collect on a debt, something he'd been doing for years, and he never asked what the debt was. He was simply given a name. He called ahead. He always called ahead. He said that was his own rule, to give people time to prepare, so he wouldn't have to knock on a door while other people were still inside the house. He arranged to meet in a supermarket parking lot because he didn't want to go to the man's home. He arrived early. He waited. He saw Ruben's car parked in the outermost row and waited for him to step out. He never did. Otto stopped for a long time there. Then he said he walked over. He knocked on the window. The man inside the car was slumped over the steering wheel. Otto opened the door. He called to him. He helped him sit upright and loosened the buttons at his collar so he could breathe more easily. And while he was doing that, something fell onto the floor of the car, but he didn't notice it at the time. He called an ambulance immediately afterward. He gave the address, the row number, the color of the car. Then he went back to his own vehicle and backed away several dozen yards. And he sat there. He said he sat inside his car and watched through the windshield until the ambulance arrived, until they lifted the man out, until the lights disappeared and the ambulance drove away. Then he drove home. He didn't follow. He didn't go to the hospital. He didn't call later to ask what had happened. "Why?" Cora said. Her voice was very quiet. Otto didn't answer immediately. "Because I was the reason he was sitting in that parking lot at that hour," he said. No one spoke. Neve remained still, both hands resting on the table. Then Otto reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He took out a small paper box. It had yellowed with age, the folds softened, the kind of box jewelry shops use for repaired pieces. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward Cora. "This fell onto the floor of the car that night," he said. "I picked it up. I meant to give it to someone at the hospital. Then I never went to the hospital." Cora didn't touch the box. "I kept it for 3 years," Otto said. "I passed your apartment 4 times. I know which door is yours. I stood outside it 4 times, And not once did I ring the bell, because I knew what the first thing I would have to say was. He looked down at his hands. The first thing I would have to say was that I was the man who called your father that night. Cora reached out. She opened the box. Inside was a wedding ring, gold, thick, worn smooth along the inside, the kind of ring someone wears for more than 20 years without ever taking it off. She stared at it for a long time. Then she picked it up. She didn't put it on her ring finger. She tried it on her thumb, because that was the only finger it would fit. And it did fit. It slid down and stopped exactly where it should, and Cora sat there with her father's wedding ring on her thumb and said nothing. Neve asked whether it was their father's ring. Cora said yes. The girl held out her hand, and Cora slipped the ring off and placed it in her palm, and Neve closed her fingers around it and held it there. Otto stood up. "I'll go," he said. "Sit down," Elias said. Otto sat. Elias looked at him. "The file you gave me. How long did you have it?" "Since that day." 3 years. 3 years. Why did you only give it to me now?" Otto didn't answer right away. He looked at Nev, then Cora, then lowered his eyes. "When you told me to investigate the name Whitlock, I already knew who it was," he said. "I went home that night and sat there for a long time. Then the next day, I came down to the restaurant and saw the 2 sisters sitting at that table out there." He paused. "I gave you that file because I didn't want to be the only person who knew anymore. 3 years is too long to know something like that alone." Cora stood up. She walked into the kitchen. She turned on the faucet, washed her hands, turned the water off. Then she stood there with her back to everyone in the room and didn't say a single word to the man sitting outside. No forgiveness, no accusation, nothing at all. She only stood there until she could breathe normally again. A few days later, Curtis Mallory sat in a room inside the federal building and read his official statement, and the news traveled quickly through the city. Frank Odell heard about it Thursday afternoon. Friday afternoon, Neve stood at the bus stop on the avenue the way she did every day after her Braille lesson. And a man came up beside her, said her name, told her that something had happened to her sister at work and that someone had asked him to come pick her up. He spoke politely. He knew Cora's name. He knew the name of the restaurant. Neve got into the car. They had driven for a while when she realized something was wrong. The hospital near Bellamy's was in the direction that required 3 right turns in a row. She had traveled that route many times and knew it with her body. This car turned left, then left again, then a 3rd time. Neve said nothing. She rested her head against the window and breathed evenly, slowly and deeply, exactly like someone who was asleep, and she began to count. She counted how many times the car came to a complete stop and how many times it only slowed down. She counted 2 elevated trains passing overhead, the first on the left, the second on the right, which meant the car had looped around beneath the tracks. She smelled the sweet, rich scent of the chocolate factory, a smell everyone in the city knew, and she noted that it came after the first train. She heard the tires change sound as they crossed a steel bridge, that steady, humming vibration unmistakable from anything else. Then, far in the distance, came a deep, drawn-out horn, the kind only a barge made. The car stopped at a roadside service station. The man got out to buy coffee. Neve said she needed to use the restroom. He hesitated, then walked her to the door and waited outside. Inside, she took the Braille reader from her bag, the device with a recording button that Cora had taught her to use long ago, and pressed record. She didn't say where she was because she didn't know. She didn't say she was afraid. She said 3 left turns. She said train on the left, then train on the right. She said chocolate factory after the first train. She said steel bridge, then barge horn. She said his voice didn't sound like someone from this city. She sent the recording to her sister, slipped the device back into her bag, washed her hands, and walked out wearing the expression of a girl who had just woken up. At Bellamy's, Cora listened to the entire recording and collapsed into a chair. Elias listened once and said nothing. He listened a second time. He told her to play it a 3rd time, and this time he closed his eyes. Otto stood in the doorway, gripping a ring of keys tightly in his hand. When the recording ended, Elias opened his eyes. 2 train lines crossing, a chocolate factory, a steel bridge, and barges, he said. There is only one place in this city where all 4 can be heard from the same spot. Cora shot to her feet. Where? He was already heading for the door. South side, by the canal. Otto tossed him the keys. and Elias caught them without looking. Cora ran after him to the car, and he told her to stay behind, and she said no, and he didn't repeat himself a second time. On the way, she sat in the passenger seat with the device in her hand and played the recording once more, only to hear her sister's voice. There wasn't a single tremor in it. The girl recited each detail as though she were reading a grocery list. Cora listened to the end, then buried her face in both hands, and Elias didn't say anything. He only pressed harder on the gas. They found Neve at a roadside diner beside a warehouse near the canal, sitting in the last booth with a glass of milk in front of her and her cane propped beside her. The girl heard her sister's voice from outside the door and stood up before Cora even had time to call her name. The man who had brought her there was already gone by the time he saw the car pull up. No one chased after him. Cora wrapped her arms around her sister and didn't ask a single question for the first several minutes, and Neve spoke into her shoulder, saying she was fine, that the man had even bought her milk, and Cora had to turn her face away. Otto drove the two sisters home. Elias didn't go with them. He drove to Frank Odell's house on the west side of the city and went inside alone, without calling anyone to come with him, carrying nothing except a file tucked under his arm. Frank was sitting in the living room watching television. He didn't look surprised. He only pointed toward the chair across from him and told Elias to sit down, and Elias didn't. He placed the file on the table between them. "Mallory's statement is in there," he said, "along with the construction company's books, along with the reconciliations from the accountant you hired, along with the promissory note bearing the forged signature." Frank turned off the television. "You have 10 minutes, Elias said. "You leave this city. You don't come back. After 10 minutes, I hand this over." Frank sat silently for a while. Then he laughed. He truly laughed, a low chuckle in his throat, and pointed at the file. "Did you read that carefully, Elias? Your name is in there too. I know. You're the head of this family. That construction company has been in your name since the day your father died. You hand that over, and the first person they're going to question is you." "I know." Frank leaned back. The ease slowly returned to his face, and that was the worst part, because it showed that he genuinely believed what he was about to say. "You won't do it." He spread his hands. "You inherited this house. You inherited this name. You can hate it. Fine. Everyone hates their father sometimes. But you're not going to burn down the thing that's feeding you with your own hands. No one does that. Your father did. Your grandfather didn't." He picked up the television remote and rolled it between his fingers. "Sit down. Then we'll talk like reasonable men." Elias looked at him. Then he bent down, picked up the file, tucked it back under his arm. "You just used up your 10 minutes, he said, "telling me you don't understand me." He walked toward the door. Behind him, Frank called his name twice, the second time louder than the first, and Elias didn't repeat himself and didn't turn around. That night, he went back to the sisters' apartment. Neve was already asleep. Cora sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water she hadn't touched. She asked what had happened, and he told her briefly. Then she asked the question she'd been carrying in her mind the entire ride home. If we hadn't found her, what were they going to do to her? Elias didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Nothing. Cora looked up. The instructions were to treat her well, feed her, let her sleep somewhere decent. Then after a few days, buy her a bus ticket home, and even tell the driver to keep an eye on her. Cora stared at him as though he'd spoken in another language. "I don't understand. Because the point wasn't the girl," he said. "The point was you." He placed both hands on the table. "If that had happened, then for those few days you would have gone all over this city. You would have called the police. You would have called everyone you knew, and you would have learned that there was nothing you could do. Then the girl would have come home unharmed, well cared for, and no one would have laid a finger on her. You would have had nothing to report. You would have had only one thing left in your head, and it would have stayed there for the rest of your life." Cora couldn't speak. "That in this city, you can't protect your sister," he said. "And after that, you would have left on your own. No one would have had to force you out. No one would have had to threaten you. You would have packed your own things." He paused. He didn't need to do anything. He only needed to show you that he could. Cora sat in silence for a long time. Then she asked, her voice gone hoarse, "How do you know that so well?" Elias looked down at the tabletop. "Because that's how I was taught," he said. The next morning, Elias didn't come to Bellamy's. He took the file to the federal building, walked straight through security, and sat in a windowless room for nearly the entire day. He started from the beginning. He told them about the construction company, about the loans being collected under the family name, about the accountant who had been hired and then trapped beneath a fabricated debt to keep him silent. He told them about the parts no one had even asked about, the parts only he knew, the parts that had carried his name since the day his father died and that no one could separate from him now. His lawyer asked for a break midway through the session and took him into the hallway to tell him privately that he wasn't required to disclose those parts. Elias said he knew. Then he went back inside and kept talking. Cora knew nothing about it until Otto called her that evening. She went to the federal building the following morning and waited in the second-floor hallway. And she stood there for almost 2 hours before the door opened and Elias came out with his lawyer. He saw her and stopped. The lawyer walked a few more steps, stopped too, understood, then kept going. "You didn't tell me," Cora said. "No. When were you planning to tell me?" "I wasn't." She stood there with both hands clenched inside the pockets of her coat. "Because if I'd told you," he continued, "you would have told me not to do it." "Yes, and I would have done it anyway." "I know." She drew in a breath. "That's the worst part." He told her what was going to happen. That entire list would be erased, legally erased. Erased through official documents bearing seals, not through anyone's promise. Frank Odell would go to court, and in the case file, under the loan-bearing Reuben Whitlock's name, there would be a line stating that the debt had never existed, that the promissory note was fraudulent, that the accountant had refused to certify false figures. Her father's name would be there, in a federal court record, cleared forever. Cora turned her face away for a while. Then she asked what it was going to cost him. He told her the number, and it was more than a year. For a long time, she couldn't say anything. People moved back and forth through the hallway, shoes striking the stone floor, someone laughing at the far end. "Do you realize you just made another decision for me?" she said. He didn't argue. "You assumed that if I knew beforehand, I'd stop you. You didn't ask me. You just calculated everything yourself and did what you decided to do." She looked directly at him. "Next time, tell me. I don't need you to obey me. You can still do whatever you believe is right, but I need you not to make me the last person to know." Elias nodded. He didn't promise. He only nodded. And Cora understood that it was the closest thing to a promise this man knew how to give. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out something wrapped in tissue paper. He opened it. It was the watch. "When did you get this?" "You left it in the drawer in the restaurant kitchen. You took it off while washing vegetables and forgot it that day." Cora took it from him. The case was unchanged. The diagonal scratch across the glass was still there. The leather strap was still soft and old exactly as it had been. She turned it over. The engraved words still sloped slightly downward at the end. Exactly where they had always been. "You've never been late for me." "I replaced the movement inside," he said. "The old one was broken beyond repair. I told them to keep the case exactly as it was. I made sure they didn't touch the back." Cora closed the watch inside her palm. "It ran slow," she said. "Not anymore." She fastened it around her wrist. The two of them stood there for a while longer without saying anything else. She didn't say she would wait for him. He didn't ask her to wait. They both knew that a stretch of time like that was too long for promises spoken only because people couldn't bear the silence of saying goodbye. Finally, she asked whether there was anything he needed her to bring him. He said no. She asked whether she would be allowed to visit. He looked at her for a long time, before saying he thought it would be better if she didn't. And she understood that he wasn't saying it for his own sake. Then the lawyer appeared again at the far end of the hallway and called Elias's name. Elias left. Cora stayed exactly where she was until he disappeared around the corner, and she didn't call after him, and she didn't cry there either. She waited until she reached the parking lot. The paper slipped out of the personnel file when Cora lifted it from the drawer, and she picked it up thinking it was scrap. It was handwritten in blue ink. The writing slanted and hurried. There was a date in the upper corner. She read the date first, then had to read it again, because it was exactly 1 day before her interview. Margot, if anyone with the last name Whitlock applies for any position, don't tell me. Handle the application exactly the way you would any other. Don't let me know what you decide, and don't tell me the outcome either. I have no right to interfere with that life. Cora sat down on the floor of the records room with the paper in her hand. She read it a third time. Then she carried it outside, found Margot at the counter, and placed it on the wooden surface in front of her. Margot looked down, and she didn't need to read it. She only looked at the date in the corner, then lowered herself into a chair. "I thought I'd filed that somewhere else," she said. "You knew he was looking for my family. I knew he was looking for someone named Whitlock. I didn't know why. He didn't tell me. He just handed me this and left." Cora picked up the paper. "So that day when I walked in, you already had this in your cabinet." "I did." "And you still closed my application." "I still closed it," Margot said. "Because this says to handle it like every other application. 34 minutes late means I close the file. I've done the same with other people. That's exactly what I did." Cora sat down in the chair beside her. For months, there had been a question inside her that she'd never spoken aloud, not even to herself, and now all of it rose to the surface. "And him," she said. "That day he came down to the kitchen. He asked me one question, then gave you one nod." Margot looked at her. "That nod," Cora said, "that was when I got hired, wasn't it?" "No." Cora looked up. "I'd already hired you before that," Margot said, "while you were still standing over the pan. I tasted one spoonful and I'd made up my mind. You just didn't know it." She removed her glasses and began cleaning them, the habit she always fell into when she had to say something she'd kept to herself for a long time. "He came down because he was carrying 3 papers he'd just signed and happened to be walking past. He smelled the onions. He stopped because of that smell, not because of you." Cora said nothing. "He asked how long you left them there before adding the liquid." "You remember." "I remember. He trained in a kitchen once. He asks that question every time he sees someone standing over that pan, and no one had ever answered the way you did. People usually give him a number. You said until the bottom of the pan changes color for the second time." Margot put her glasses back on. "That nod was him telling me your answer was right. That's all. He didn't ask your name. He didn't look at your application. He went back upstairs, and he kept his word on this paper until you'd already been working here for several days." Cora sat quietly for a very long time. Out in the dining room, people were beginning to set the tables for lunch service. "I kept thinking," she said, then stopped. "You kept thinking you were hired because of your father." "Yes. How long have you believed that?" "Since I found out he was looking for my family," Cora said. "I was afraid to ask. I was afraid of the answer." Margot reached for the stack of reservation slips. "He has enough money to buy this entire neighborhood," she said. "He could have paid you a lump sum and told you to go find another job. Much easier, much cleaner." She turned a page. "But he wrote this instead. Before he ever saw your face, before he knew you had a sister, he took his own right to decide out of the equation and handed it to me, a woman on his payroll." Cora folded the paper and slipped it into her coat pocket. "Can I keep it?" "It's yours," Margot said. "It always was." Neve received her acceptance letter for a music therapy program in Seattle at the end of spring, with a full scholarship. And the only condition was that a family member needed to accompany her during the first year. Cora sold her old car, left Bellamy's with Margot's promise that her place would still be there if she ever came back, and the 2 sisters left for Seattle. In Seattle, Neve learned faster than even she had expected. By the middle of the school year, she could make her way from the dormitory to the music building without anyone accompanying her, memorizing every slope, every sunken patch of sidewalk, every door that was heavy, and every door that closed by itself. She began an internship at a center for older adults, playing music for men and women who could no longer remember the names of their own children, and she came home one day saying that there was an elderly woman who hadn't spoken a single sentence in months, but when she heard the right old song, she began tapping her hand to the rhythm. Cora listened and said nothing, because she was thinking about how someone had once taught her sister how to knock. One day, the school recommended Neve for an experimental surgery program on the East Coast. The doctor spoke to the 2 sisters over the phone and was very direct. He said the chances of success were low, that they would have to fly back and forth many times, that it could take a year and still change nothing in the end. Cora sat with a pen in her hand, taking notes throughout the call. When it ended, she immediately began calculating how she could afford the plane tickets and how she would arrange time off from work. Neve listened to her for a while, then said she wasn't going. Cora stopped writing. "You heard him clearly, didn't you? He said there's a chance." "A chance is still waiting," Neve said. "I don't want to spend my whole life in the waiting room of a miracle. I have work to do now. I'm doing it well. If I go, my entire next year will be waiting, then disappointment, then waiting again. Cora set down the pen and couldn't speak. "Don't think I'm giving up," Neve said. "I'm not giving anything up. I'm choosing what I already have." Cora sat in silence for a long time. Then she spoke, and her voice broke on the very first word, saying that she owed Neve something, and had owed it to her for all these years, that if she'd done things differently that night, Neve wouldn't have to choose between these two things now. Neve turned her head toward her sister. "Cora," she said, "I need to tell you something." She sat up straighter. "That night, I wasn't asleep." Cora looked up. "I lay there the whole time, and I didn't sleep for a single minute. I heard everything. I heard you open the kitchen drawer. I heard you count the money. You counted it twice because you got it wrong the first time." Cora raised a hand to her mouth. "I heard you get up. Twice. Both times I heard the chair scrape back and heard you pick up the phone." Neve paused, and both times I started breathing more deeply. The entire room went silent. "I did it on purpose," she said. "I lay still and breathed like I was sleeping deeply, slow and even, so you'd hear me and think I was getting better. Because I knew that if you thought I was still having trouble breathing, you'd call, and I knew what we didn't have in that house back then. I was 14. I didn't know anything about being sick, but I knew how to count. I lived in that house. I heard everything that happened in that house. How could I not know?" Cora collapsed. She sank onto the floor beside the chair and cried out loud, the kind of crying she'd held locked inside her chest since she was 22 years old and had never once allowed to come out. Neve slid down onto the floor beside her, found her sister's hand, and held it. "You've been apologizing to me for years," she said. "You apologize by working 3 jobs at once. You apologize by never buying anything for yourself. Did you really think I didn't know?" She tightened her grip on Cora's hand. "Now it's my turn." Cora shook her head. "I'm sorry," Neve said, "for letting you believe all these years that it was your fault. I knew what I did that night. I knew from the moment I did it, and I didn't tell you. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd be angry with me. And then the longer I waited, the harder it became to say anything at all." The two sisters sat on the floor for a long time. Outside the window, rain was falling over Seattle. The light, persistent kind of rain that belonged to that city. No one was to blame. "Cora," Neve said, "we just didn't have any money back then. And that wasn't your fault. And it wasn't mine either." The following summer, someone rang the bell at the Seattle apartment on a Saturday afternoon. Cora opened the door and needed several seconds before she recognized the man standing there. Curtis Mallory had lost a great deal of weight. His shirt was old, and in his hand he held a sheet of paper folded in half. He opened it and began to read. He read that he had fabricated the debt under her father's name, that the debt had never existed, that he had gone to her home many times demanding money. Her family had never owed anyone. He read slowly, and in places he had to stop to find his line, and his hands shook enough to make the paper rustle. Cora asked why he had to read it. He said because he was afraid that if he stood in front of people he would forget something, and if he forgot, then it wouldn't feel sincere, and he'd already forgotten once at the 4th house on the list. Cora asked which house she was. He said she was number 9. She asked how he'd gotten there. He said he'd gotten off the bus down the street and walked the rest of the way. Cora looked down at his shoes. She didn't tell him she forgave him. She didn't tell him it was all right. She only opened the door wider and told him to come in and have a glass of water first, because it was hot outside and he'd just walked a long way. Mallory drank the entire glass standing in the kitchen doorway, not daring to sit down. Then he thanked her and left. Cora closed the door, leaned her back against it, then sank to the floor right there and cried for a long time. Not because she felt sorry for him, and not because she hated him, but because for so many years she'd believed that her family's suffering had come from some failure in themselves. By autumn, Neve could manage everything in Seattle on her own, and she told her sister to go home, that she didn't need Cora there anymore, that she needed Cora to live. Cora returned to Chicago on an October afternoon. She walked from the train station to River North, and when she turned onto the familiar street, she stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. The sign was different. It wasn't Bellamy's anymore. It said Whitlock's. She stood there looking at it for a long time. Margot later told her that Rosalind had transferred ownership of the entire restaurant to a foundation she had created, one that would pay tuition for the children of the families whose names had appeared on that old list. And when people asked her what the restaurant should be called, She simply said she wanted it named after the accountant who had refused to put his signature beneath something false, and that it was time someone knew his name. Cora pushed open the door and stepped inside. The kitchen smelled of burning onions. Actually burning. Scorched badly enough that someone muttered a curse, and a pan scraped sharply away from the stove. She walked through the kitchen doorway and stopped there. A man stood in front of the pan, his sleeves rolled past his elbows, his apron tied crooked, more gray now showing at his temples. He was thinner than before. He looked up and saw her. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Then he looked down at the pan. "First batch," he said. "Burned. I can see that. More than a year without working a stove." Cora stepped toward the counter. She took the watch from her wrist and placed it on the wooden surface between them. "It's running slow again," she said. Elias looked down at the watch. 4 minutes? 3. He picked it up, turned it over, and looked at the engraved words that still sloped slightly downward at the end. Then he put it back exactly where it had been. "Then I'll wait another 3 minutes," he said. No ring came out of anyone's pocket. No one made promises to anyone. There were only 2 people standing in a kitchen that smelled of burned onions, and another batch that needed to be started again from the beginning. Cora and Elias's story leaves us with a few very simple truths. First, some people spend their whole lives apologizing for being late, when in truth they are the ones who have always been there at exactly the right moment for the people who needed them most. Second, loving someone doesn't mean making decisions for them, so they won't have to suffer. It means respecting them enough to let them choose for themselves, then still being there after they've made that choice. And third, not everyone needs to be healed. Some people only need to be trusted and seen for exactly who they already are. And what about you? If you were Cora, would you have opened the door for the man standing outside holding that piece of paper? And if you were Elias, would you have dared to tell the truth knowing that telling it would cost you everything? If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories every day. We would truly love to read your thoughts in the comments, because every word you share from the deepest part of your heart is precious to us. We sincerely wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.